Winnipeg win in Washington, the massive JT Miller trade, the Luka Doncic trade, not NHL, but I know pretty crazy. What a weekend in sports. Let's chat about it on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are chatting about quite an interesting weekend in the NHL. The Winnipeg Jets, of course, the most important story, beating the Washington Capitals 5-4 in overtime and coming away with a victory. But there was a lot of other stuff to talk about, including the top line's performance against the Caps. In my mind, I think it says a lot about why I continue to be a bit skeptical of this trio heading into the playoffs, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, let's start off with Winnipeg versus Washington. First off, what a game. I was there in person. It was a blast. Had a lot of fun. For the first time in ages, I actually had a heart rate against an opponent, right? The Jets have gotten really used to just smacking up opponents, and finally they've come against a team that, doesn't really let itself get pushed around. The Caps, when you look at their record, may not have as many wins, but they have more overtime losses. This is a squad that does not quit, and I think it's a lot like the Jets in that they will continue to harass you even if they're playing poorly until the very end. There haven't been many games where the Jets themselves this year have just straight up, looked completely uncompetitive. Even if it's only for a period, the Jets usually do still put on at least some kind of a show. In this game, Winnipeg really came out of the gates swinging big, though. They got up to a 2-0 lead and were out shooting Washington like 15-6, and it was like a really good performance from most of the lines. You really didn't have too many issues other than, when Logan Stanley was on the ice, the Caps did tend to have a lot more extended offensive zone possession and some of their best chances. But again, there weren't that many chances. It wasn't until the second and third periods where the Caps started to wake up. And at this point, you kind of knew that there might be a little bit of trouble. The Jets, thankfully, were able to keep the goal scoring up. Guys like Iafallo and Sandberg and Perfetti and Morrissey were able to keep things going. A couple of really great tips, some nice power play work, just a generally good performance from Dylan Sandberg, who in my mind was one of the first stars of the night for the Jets. He was unbelievable. And in my mind, I continue to think that his next contract might be a little heftier than we're all expecting. He's starting to add those points to his record. And, points are often one of the biggest things for a contract extension for a blue liner, even if that's not really their predominant job. But I think for, Sandberg, we now have two left-sided guys who are basically top pairing players. Sandberg is an anchor for this team. Next to Morrissey, he is one of our MVP skaters. And, I think it says a lot about when he went down for like a month and a half that the Jets really just did not play that well. He is really the linchpin of this defense outside of Josh. And without him, I really don't know where this team would be. So Sandberg has really evolved into this elite player. Can't believe we have him. And a lot of teams would probably kill to try and get him. So if Winnipeg wants to sauce him like a 7 or an 8-year deal, hey, sign me up. I am all for locking him up for the foreseeable future. But in terms of this game, the Jets did kind of start to buckle as time went on. The blue line, it was especially tested. DeMello had a really rough outing, and, I love him. He's been better lately, but I think against these top teams, this is where some of my concerns about his foot speed and some of his decision-making can occasionally be problematic. It's not been often recently that he's had a really rough outing, but this game, definitely not his finest. Stanley, right? Miller would try to make clearances. Stanley would occasionally fail at that. and that pairing did get pinned. Now, I've set aside a more, I would say, dedicated portion to talking about the top line because this one is a tough one, right? Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I know that it's a small sample size. The Jets have not played a lot of elite teams recently. And so, against elite teams, you do expect at times that your top players may not perform as well. But the top line in this game was just outright bad. This is one of the few times recently where they've been completely either muted or just bad. Now, you'll see the score sheet does reflect a couple of assists and stuff for Scheifele, one for Connor, and so you're like, oh, was it really that bad? But if you actually were there and you saw how they performed, it was pretty ugly. They were out-created, they were pinned down, and they showed a lot of why I continue to have big concerns about them heading into the playoffs. The last couple of weeks, yes, they've been torching, but they've been torching against either teams that are just barely above 500 or are just outright basically out of the playoff picture. So this is the first real opponent in a good long while that's truly elite. Like the Avs, I think, were probably the closest opponent that's typically given the Jets fits. And Colorado even has its own issues right now. So, it's a really tough one. But I would not be as concerned if there wasn't a longer history of this from previous seasons. But I think it's something to really bear in mind going forward, that this could be a bit of a problem if the Jets can't turn it around, against top-end matchups. Because once you get to the playoffs, that's who you're predominantly going to be facing. Now, the first round might not be a big deal for the Jets because they might be facing like a Calgary or something. But not that you want to take Calgary lightly, but I don't worry about that kind of team as much as I worry about a Vegas or a Dallas, some of these other squads. Even Dallas, I think the Jets could technically handle. Minnesota, I think Winnipeg would be fine. But you've got to figure out how to get this top line going when you're facing truly, truly great teams, because that's who you have to eventually gonna face, most likely, the deeper you go. But if we're looking for some other standouts in a positive light, the second line, for the most part, I thought was very good. Nemesnikov had a really nice, solid game for the most part. Perfetti notched himself a goal and an assist. Vlad, I thought, was doing good forechecking. Perfetti cleaned up on a power play goal opportunity and collected an assist earlier in the game. So just a really fun outing for him. Ever since he said he needed to play like a prick a couple of weeks ago, he has been on like a 4 or 5 point streak. So good to see him back up the standards. Otherwise, Parker Ford's second NHL game, this one was a little tougher for him. There was one particular turnover that he had that I think he probably would not have attempted if he, saw the outcome in the future. That turnover in his own zone right in front of Hellebuck, a backhand cross-lot pass, probably not one that he's going to make at the NHL level again. So, bit of a learning curve, but welcome to the NHL, kid. It is your second game, and of course, you are facing the number one team in the NHL. That outside of Washington or outside of Winnipeg, right? Because the Jets are currently in first, but Washington leads the Eastern Conference, second in the league, first in the East. What a heck of an NHL debut against your hometown team first. You have a goal. Your second team, you are facing the best of the East. So, wow, what a start to his NHL career, huh? One other quiet little note of interest, David Gustafsson continues to really impress me. I really do think he deserves a bigger role with this team. His forechecking and work has really been stellar. One of the goals in this game for the Jets directly came off of him creating offensive zone pressure. I think he forced a turnover or something, if I recall correctly, and he was just a wrecking ball. The fact that he doesn't get more love on this team is crazy. I think he actually has some real shades of Lowry in him, and right now, I'd actually like to see what he could do up somewhere in the middle six. So hopefully the Jets give him a longer look. He has really stood out to me in a positive way recently. But, earlier I mentioned I want to chat about the top line because I don't know which version of them we're going to see in the postseason. And whether it's this version or the one that's played really well the last couple of weeks, I actually think it is probably worth a conversation. Let's chat about that in just a brief moment. But before we get there, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Gametime. Looking for tickets to your next big event, whether you're into a concert or a comedy show or even a hockey game like the Jets, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. But with Gametime Picks, it's never been easier. Let me explain, right? With Gametime Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. The curated deals make it super easy to find great tickets at a great price. No more sifting through thousands of options. Last year, I used Gametime before they added picks and picked up a great seat, for Kansas City versus Baltimore. Excellent value for where I was sitting, considering the playoff ticket prices and all that fun stuff. It was very helpful. And of course, now they'll sort it through you even faster, and you'll always be backed by, their lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal somewhere, they will refund 110% of the difference. And your tickets will always be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something pops up. If you want to be like me and take the guesswork out of buying tickets, download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about some interesting stuff that kind of came out of the Caps game. And I know we've had some back and forth on this in the comments. Last game before this, there was conversation about the Jets having the best top line in the league. And I think, having the Jets play against a lot of weaker and inferior teams, you'd have that impression very quickly, right? The Jets' top line, when they have time and space, they will absolutely carve up almost anyone. And I think it's a lot of why, the coaching staff continues to try and make this thing happen, right? Winnipeg's top line, against bottom feeder or even mediocre, middle of the pack or just above middle of the pack opponents, they can generally feast. Where I continue to have issues with them is where they face top opponents, right? And Garrett Hull actually pulled some data from Puck IQ on, the Jets' top forwards against best on best, right? If you're facing top opposition, how do the Jets' forwards rank? Ehlers and Velarde are kind of at around 51% shot share. Scheifele and Nino, 50%. And then, guys like Appleton, Perfetti, Iafallo, 49-ish. Surprisingly, Lowry and Connor and Vlad are around 48%. So, in isolation, obviously, this is just individual skaters. There's not as much context here. But what I think, has traditionally come out of other opposing top lines when you talk about the Jets is that Winnipeg usually scores a lot. But in terms of actually driving play, if you look at top trios from around the league, Winnipeg's shot share advantage with this top line is pretty much break even. Your typical top line is going to drive around 53 to 55% shot share on the ice, which is, pretty decent, right? And maybe 3 to 5% doesn't sound that significant. But I think when you actually watch how the top line plays for the Jets, it's not really surprising that Winnipeg sometimes struggles to create when they're out there against really elite opposition. The lack of foot speed, I think, is one thing. And, previously Kyle Connor's defensive awareness was a huge problem for getting not only the puck out of the defensive zone, but then turning that into offense up the other way. It's been less of a problem this year because KFC himself has been really, really good. He's finally looking like a true, in all senses of the word, top liner. Yes, he'll have his defensive lapses. He's not going to force every turnover. He's not going to block every shot. But compared to what I was just asking him to do in previous years, I will unquestionably take this. If he had played like this his whole career, I never really would have questioned, even a trade or an extension. None of that. I would have been fine handing him basically a blank check. This is the first year where I feel like not only is his top line play truly top line, but he's actually, just really evolved his game. He's making better decisions with the puck. He's been more careful. I think his man marking and backtracking have been more effective. And because he's doing that work, it's actually leading to more offense. He's getting the puck back out faster, and it's really helped the top line. And I think that's really noticeable when you're playing bad teams. Against really good teams, though, this is where I just have some question marks. A couple of weeks ago, or maybe even it might have been longer now, the Jets had a stretch where the top line was really 50-50. And yes, they have the skill to sort of outscore a lot of this, But once you get to the playoffs, I kind of wonder how far that's going to take you. And it's not like they can't play well against good opponents. The Colorado games, I thought the top line was a lot more at it than they were against Washington. But when you play Vegas, right? Vegas, I think, is one of the other real barometers. The Knights are one of those teams that the Jets traditionally just struggle against. Winnipeg has, finally started to turn it around against Colorado. They still haven't beat Vegas in like forever. So that continues to kind of stick out. And the reason I think I still think about this is because most of the league this year does not fall into a category of teams that trouble the Jets. Winnipeg has generally been able to get through almost everyone without a ton of problems. But there's like 3 or 4 teams that are still really annoying for the Jets to have to face. And, they've maybe been able to turn it around against Colorado. Vegas will have to wait and see a little bit. But this Jets top line has a slight history in previous years and really more in the 55-81 duo of struggling against top competition. The problem that I kind of run into with this trio is I don't know how you fix it, right? I've thought about like splitting 55 and 81 for years now, but of course, the Jets don't want to do that. The players don't want to do that. And like KFC has a fairly good argument of actually deserving to play with Scheifele this year. So if he wants to, I think that's fine. I would actually try and figure out what to do with Velarde. Gabe is really good at a lot of stuff, and he's an amazing passer. But I do think that when he's with Connor and Scheifele, that trio sometimes lacks a little bit of high-end foot speed. Like Connor can skate like the wind. It's everyone else on his line that doesn't really fit there. And so I kind of wonder if you could try Ehlers up there. I have some reservations about Connor, Scheifele, Ehlers, but comparatively speaking, that trio has still generally outproduced opponents. But because Connor's also kind of playing like Ehlers light this year, you want to make sure that you balance your top 9 with good transition skating. And so if your best 2 transition skaters are on the same line, I don't know if that's going to work. That's kind of where I wonder if a big trade really changes how this top 9 functions. The Jets are not going to break up CSV. I'm fairly certain of that. Barring a really big shock, I think that they're going to continue to keep that. And I'd be totally cool with it if they play like they did against, Montreal, Boston, these teams. But the Caps game is one where I have some pause. It gave me, a reminder that the top line still has some of that traditional top line Jets stuff. And, you don't see it that often lately because the teams that the Jets are playing are not of Washington's quality. But, once you get to the playoffs, that starts to change a bit. Obviously there's not that many teams that are as good as Washington in the postseason. They are far and away in first in the East for a reason. And, I don't want to sell the Jets short here because Winnipeg itself has frankly been a wagon. The bottom lines and the second line, really the bottom 9, I guess you could call it, have been really turning it on lately. And so when the top line doesn't turn it on, it actually stands out more because it's the only group that has, some real question marks, aside from the second line with Nemesnikov being the 2C, right? That I don't, foresee lasting, but that's a line that I think the Jets will actually mess with. I don't see them changing the first line unless there's a really big shock. Arneal, since the start of the season, really hasn't seemingly wanted to do much there. So, this is a really weird question to me because most other teams, even the Caps, will shuffle their lines pretty regularly, especially if things aren't working. The Jets are one of the few squads that tends to be pretty rigid about stuff, and so it makes me wonder what their thinking is heading into the playoffs. If they make a big acquisition, right, a big winger or a big center, how does that actually impact their top 6? If they keep CSV together, which version of this line shows up in the playoffs? Will it be the one that just kind of dances around opponents and does the Harlem Globetrotters thing? Or is it going to be the one that showed up against Washington and basically got pasted for every single shift? And again, I don't want to harp on it because I know that the Jets are doing really well, but I think this is where I still need to see another gear in some of these top opponent games where the Jets top line really, if nothing else, gets at least to break even. They haven't managed that against some of these opponents. And so, for me, that question mark still sits out there, but I mean, it is fixable. It's just something where I'm not really sure if it's going to go against the priors or if that line is finally going to start clicking and showing us that it can handle, league on league, best on best. I just don't know. I want to have a lot of confidence in them, but I have some reservations, and I have to see how this top line goes. Funny enough, Shifley didn't actually get credited with any shots on goal. Nemesnikov actually led the team in 4 against Washington, so you probably don't want to have that as much when your top line has as much skill and talent as it does. That trio combined of Shifley, Connor, and Velarde had less shots together on goal than Nemesnikov did by himself. So, again, it doesn't have to win every game and it doesn't have to be elite every single night, but, they are your breadwinners. They have to be winning more of these battles against really good teams because that's who you're going to see in the playoffs. And so, I'm optimistic that this team is going to change its playoff fortunes this year. I need to see a little bit more from a couple of key guys. Connor's kind of already done his bit. I think he's really turned his game around. Shifley, I don't think ever really was bad necessarily other than in defending. I just think it's one of those things where he has to feel like he's ready to commit, really buy in, and he'll be his usual self. But again, this trio as a line, with Velarde being, Velarde and still very good, they've got to start figuring out against elite opponents. So I have to see if that changes. But amidst all of this, I was talking about trades, and what better way to talk about it than the JT Miller trade? Let's chat about that and what it does for the market in just a little bit. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about the JT Miller trade. It has been an interesting thing, right? March 7th is the NHL trade deadline, so a lot of teams are starting to get in on the action early. We've already seen the Rantanen trade. Now we've got the Miller one. The Miller trade, a little bit of a funky one. We've had, some depth deals like the Kuzmenko deal, which for me was like a lot of middle six guys getting swapped for one another. But the JT Miller trade is for a legitimate top 6, even top line sort of center being sent to the Rangers in exchange for a lot of other parts. Now, the parts in, this deal for Vancouver, one of them actually did just score in tonight's game. They did lose, but for me, I look at this Miller deal and I kind of see it as a desperation play from the Rangers. They're bringing JT back after he's kind of been adrift for a while. Miller's a good player, but, he comes with a lot of baggage and he's got a lot of term and a pretty big salary. So you are getting a top player, but he comes with some really serious considerations. I think, he'll probably do fine for the Rangers, but New York is really, at this point, they're desperately grasping at straws, trying to figure out why the season has kind of derailed, how they can kind of get it back on track, because they do still have a shot at making the playoffs. Shesterkin is still great, but I think the Rangers at this point sort of recognize that whatever they thought their window was, it is slamming shut. Zibanejad has been awful recently. Lafreniere has kind of struggled to really drive at the level that he did last season, partly because the rest of the team has struggled. The defense is getting shellacked. And so this Rangers team just doesn't really feel like it's anywhere close to being all that competitive. And this Miller trade, while it does sort of address a big hole up front, doesn't really feel like it's going to truly move the needle in the situation that I think it should. Miller's getting swapped for Hedel and Mancini and like a conditional top round pick that's lotto protected. Actually, it's top 13 protected, which is even funnier. And sure, Vancouver sent Brandstrom the other way. I think Brandstrom actually might be one of the really underrated pieces in this deal. But the Rangers giving up Hedel in exchange, it's not a small price to pay. But it's also not crazy expensive for a guy who is, clearly the best player in the deal. And that's because, again, it's kind of like the Dubois trade. You are moving some really damaged goods. The fact that LA offered as much as it did for Dubois, to me, is still insane. I know he's young. I know he's pretty good for Washington. But at the time, man, Dubois had burned so many bridges heading to LA that I was like, wow, man, whatever the Kings are willing to offer us, which was apparently a massive haul, you better take it and run with it. And that's exactly what the Jets did. This Miller deal, I don't think is really replicable this season just because, the conditions were a little funky. there weren't that many teams that I think were willing to take on a perceived locker room cancer. And like, Miller is a fantastic top six sort of player. I think Carolina was interested, but they opted for Rantanen. I don't know what exactly happened, with this whole thing, but Miller, he probably was always destined to be a Ranger somehow. He's going back home. He's going back to a team that has familiarity with him. And so with the Jets kind of looking at all of this, I think that they've been smart about not getting involved in the recent trades. The Miller one was never going to be one that they would even be all that into anyways. I don't think the money there really makes sense. The term doesn't make sense. And they're not going to bring on somebody who has a history of being a locker room problem the way that Miller does recently. The whole Pettersson Miller debate and really the split that's happened in that room doesn't feel like something you need to replicate here, right? The Jets have already had their own locker room problems. We do not need to do it again. Let me tell you, that was already rough the first time. I cannot begin to imagine doing it, twice, even three times over. So if I have to call a winner here in this deal, it's probably Vancouver. Now, the win is very marginal, right? Hedl is really talented. I love him. He's one of my favorite Rangers players. But he also has a really bad concussion history. And so, his health is always going to be a question mark. Mancini is whatever. He is technically a prospect. His NHL tenure so far has been rough. He might not actually improve the Canucks blue line. I don't know. We'll just have to see. But Brandstrom, I actually do like heading to New York. I think he's really underappreciated, a very good player. There was also another mid-tier prospect in Dorrington sent there, but Brandstrom, in my mind, is actually one of the better NHLers moved in this exchange. He's a guy that I kind of wish the Jets had taken more of a look at, but he does kind of fall in the Heinola territory of being sort of average or even slightly smaller size, not a big guy, but a really strong puck mover with a great shot. And for some reason, he just can't seem to convince teams that he's actually good at his job, which is super interesting. He feels like a player that's going to somehow end up in Carolina in the offseason and probably kill it there. So very weird, but, this whole trade, yeah, wow. It's really funny that this happened and it was like, wow, what a big trade. And then, of course, in the NBA world, the Doncic thing happens last night and everyone's like, this is like the biggest trade in sports history across the board. So the NHL is probably still looking for its own mega blockbuster again. Haven't had too many of those lately, unless McDavid decides he is finally done with the Oilers. There actually was one other interesting little trade. One of our rivals made it. The Stars ended up getting Mikael Granlund and CC from the Sharks for like a first-round pick and a third-round pick. All I can say is I am very glad the Jets didn't do this. CC, not going to improve our defense. Granlund, he's okay if you really insulate him, but I don't think he's the 2C option for the Jets. Now, I'm sure Winnipeg is actively shopping, and I think Winnipeg is very much going to be looking for a lot of different options, some of which apparently, according to Chevy, may not already be on the market, so we'll have to see what that means. I would love some young term and skill, but we will just have to wait and see how the Jets play this deadline. There's a lot of really good options, and I think Winnipeg has some real assets to play with. And, I don't think that anything is really set in stone in terms of market prices, but I will say that the Jets might have to start doing it a little sooner with all of these teams making rapid moves. We'll just have to be patient and see what Winnipeg does. They usually don't disappoint recently when it comes to the trade deadline, but as we start to see more and more dominoes fall, I am sure we'll be talking about that over the next few weeks. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow's episode, obviously, we are going to be previewing Winnipeg's upcoming game against Carolina. That's going to be another barometer test. Now, this one will be a home game, so maybe it won't be as tough for the Jets, but, Carolina's a really good team. They just picked up Rantanen, who's really skilled, and I want to see the top line kind of, prove me wrong about how they are against first in the league or top of the league sorts of teams, right? I still, I want to be proven wrong about this because, so far I've seen mixed results, but we'll see, right? Let me know what you're thinking about all of this in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night and go Jets go.